Hi guys, in this video we're gonna cover MCP setup with Bedrock. Here are the four major things we're gonna cover as part of this tutorial. The first is Bedrock setup to configure Bedrock in your AWS account. Then we're gonna move out to see environment setup required to access and invoke Bedrock API from your local machine. Then we're gonna compare the changes which is required to change MCP client to use Bedrock instead of Anthropic API. And last, we're gonna test our changes. For configuring Bedrock, click on Bedrock on the search, select Amazon Bedrock, request access for the model, navigate to the bottom and you should see model access. In your model access panel, you should see all the models for which you have access as well as for which you still don't have access. So if you want to use any model for your testing which you don't have access, just request the access for that. I'm going to use Claude. I do have access for those. So I'm going to move forward now. Once you have requested your access, click on model catalog. Here you can see all the models for which you have access. Just select the model which you want to use. Now here is a code which you can directly use. It's gonna have model ID which we're gonna use in our code. It's gonna have the format in which the model expect the request. Now we have a model configured in our AWS. Let's move to environment setup. In order to access AWS Bedrock API, you will need AWS CLI configured on your machine. Just make sure that your credentials which you are using have access to Bedrock API, invoke Bedrock API. I already have a setup, but if you don't have, you need to give access key here and secret key and the region in which you are using your Bedrock. And that's it. Once you have configured this, you should have a AWS CLI access to your Bedrock API. So let's go to compare our code changes. For this demo, I have created an MCP client with Bedrock, as well as I have existing clients with Anthropic and a server. If you are not familiar with MCP client and the server, please do watch my previous video where I have set it up these two with Anthropic models. Now for the changes which is required to make it compatible with the Bedrock, I'll do the side-by-side comparison with the Anthropic version of MCP client and Bedrock version. We don't need any changes in the server as server has been consumed by the client and model calling is done on the client side. Now let me open the index file where we are using model calling, and let me open for Bedrock as well so we can compare them. Now for this part, on the left side I have a model MCP client which is using Anthropic, which is officially provided by Anthropic website, and this I'm gonna share the code as well so you can just see. So on the left hand side I have a MCP client version which is provided by Anthropic, and this is on the right hand side I have a customized Bedrock version which we're gonna be analyzing. So first thing you can see on the dependencies, as we are not using Anthropic, so we don't need that, and we're gonna be, instead of that, we're gonna be using Bedrock runtime. And for this we're gonna consume two modules, which is runtime client and invoke model command. Now if you move down, we can see in constructor we are initializing Anthropic and with their API key to call Anthropic model, but here we're gonna, instead of Anthropic, we're gonna initialize our Bedrock client. We are just passing the region as we have environment setup. We have already configured AWS access key and secret in our CLI. If you haven't set it up, we can also pass it here as well. So you can also pass access key here if you haven't set it up there. Now let's move down and see the other changes. Now for connecting to the server, as I said earlier, there is no changes how we communicate with the server when we use either Bedrock or Anthropic, so we don't need to make any changes here. So let's uh, remove this part and move to the next one. Now query processing is the main where we are making the changes. Now a few things we need to pay attention and understand when we are using Bedrock as compared to Anthropic. The way we call the API is different, and the request it receives are different. So first thing is like how message has been passed to Anthropic was we are passing the role and the query which was in a string format. In Bedrock, we do use the same thing, role, but at the same time you can see the content is not a string. Instead of that is an array of objects which accepts type and query as a text. The other important aspect here is, so the tools was by default supported by Anthropic API. We don't have to do anything there, but for Bedrock, how it accepts tool is an array of object, and the object request it accepts name, description, and input schema. So once we receive the tool from the server, we need to create a map for the tools before we create a payload for our Bedrock API. The next, as I showed you earlier in our AWS console, the payload except there was some required parameters which we are setting up and which is a little different than the call which we are making to Anthropic. So this is the payload setting before we make any API call there. Now message is something we set it up above, and the tools we created a map from the tools. Now this is then we are passing again building our command for our input request for our Bedrock, and then we are building our input request. Now all of this code which I've seen here is just the input request which we build based on the tools and the message for our API call, and this is the API call which we are making to the Anthropic. So instead of this making this call, we just change based on the documentation which has been provided by the Bedrock, and you can see here it's the same response we got from there. And then another important thing, the response type is different. Response type from Anthropic looks like it was text, but here it's not simple. We are getting encoding response from a Bedrock, so we need to decode it before we can use it. Then once we decode it, the response type is same, so we don't have to make any changes here. And we're gonna move down. Now once we move down, so we have another Anthropic call, another request call here. So we again gonna repeat the same process where we have a message, we're gonna change the format, we're gonna build the tools for it for our request call, and then we gonna build the payload, and then we invoke our request. So the same thing has been repeated here. So the major change which are, and then again we decode once the response are there. Now again for decoding part, I'm using same Claude model, so I mean I'm expecting the same response type which was in their official documentation. But if you change the model, this response type might differ, so just keep an eye on it and try to test it. I haven't tested with any other model at this point. And yeah, so these are the only changes which is required. So let's test this if our changes are working. For testing, I am inside Bedrock client for MCP, and let's build and then see our changes. Once the build is completed, we should see a build folder which we gonna call so build folder, and we are pointing it to our weather server path, basically the build file for this one. So now it is able to get call the server and get basically two tools which we have. Now let's see if it is able to call this tool and get the weather. Perfect. It seems it is working, and yeah, MCP client is started with the Bedrock. That's perfect, and it's making the able to call the server, MCP server, and get the detail. So in this tutorial, we have seen how to configure with the Bedrock. If you have any questions, comment down below, and I'll get back to you. And thank you so much.